Right. Okay. So, yeah, today we're going to get into chapter 4. So, chapter 4 in the Practice Social Research book is a pretty meaty chapter. It covers a lot of pretty key things when one is going to set forth and do a research project. So this is the last chapter we're going to cover before your first exam. And so if you're an undergraduate in this course, you have exams to take for this course. And so that exam, it'll be a take-home exam. I'll give you at least a week to complete it. It will be a lot of short answer essay type questions that ask you about the things we've been talking about in the class thus far, but it will cover chapters 1 through 4. I'll probably have that posted by no later than this Friday up on Moodle, so you can work on that. And it won't be due any sooner than the following Friday. So you'll have plenty of time to work on it. It's not a time test or anything. You just download the Word document and complete it, and then upload your completed document. If there are questions about the exam, you can always email me, and I can, if you can't fish for answers, I will tell you, well, you have to read through your chapters, look through the slideshows. That is going to give you plenty of information to answer these questions. So that's coming up here towards the end of this week. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk about chapter 4. Now, I noticed I messed up on my dates. The short answer, or the chapter question that I wanted to talk about today is not due till tomorrow. So we'll hold off on talking about that until Thursday. So we'll hold off on that. There are some things, though, that you can earn participation points in today's lecture. So you'll have an opportunity to participate, but we'll hold off on getting people's responses to the end of that previous chapter until Thursday. But what I want to go ahead and do is bring up. Oops, where are we at here? Okay, so all right. Now, if you can't see this, somebody just wave their hand at the screen, but you should be, the screen is saying the criteria for causality, okay? And so can everybody see that? Somebody give me a thumbs up if that's okay, that you can see it. Okay, great, very good. So yeah, when we're doing what's called nomothetic research, and if you recall, nomothetic research is the kind of research that most social scientists are engaged in. That's where you're taking a large number of observations to in turn make inferences about an even larger number of unobserved things. So the population uses a sample to make inferences about the population. So that is what is typically done, and that comes along with statistics and procedures for doing statistics that we'll get into later in the class. And so while there is quantitative, the ideographic type research, that we'll touch on that later in the class as well, a lot of your social science research does have a quantitative bent to it, and has at least this nomothetic bent to it, where you are, if you want to make broad sweeping statements about difference between men and women, or differences between different social classes, different ethnic groups, you would better have a large sample from the population if you're going to make inferences about any of these groups. And so social scientists like to do this stuff, and so it's very important that we have a large sample we can take to make inferences from. Once we have that, okay, then we have to figure out, okay, what is causing what in this data set. So there are 3 basic criteria that need to be met in order for one to say that I think X is having a causal impact on Y. And so X is usually what is used to indicate an independent variable having an influence on Y, which is usually the letter that's used to indicate the dependent variable. So X is the independent variable having an impact on Y, the dependent variable. So anyway, that's where those letters come from. That's why it's X and Y, I don't know. That's just the convention. So the easiest one to usually show, and that's the one that you have to show, if you don't even show this, then it's back to the drawing board, your theory is completely wrong, is a correlation. And a correlation is just an association between 2 things. Later on, we'll talk about what's called Pearson's R correlation. That's the most common statistic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you actually have to calculate what R is to qualify for a correlation. This just means some broad association between two things. You could look at a cross tabulation table, which we'll do later, and just see, okay, if there's a higher percent in this category associated with this group than this group, there's some association going on there. So it doesn't really have to be a Pearson's R correlation to identify whether or not you can say that two things are correlated. And so for these examples, I'm looking at a lot of parent-child relationships as a example to show correlation. And so you could probably assume, safely assume, that on average, we always have to preface this stuff by saying on average, that levels of supervision in a single parent home are probably going to be less so than a two-parent home, for the simple fact that you have an extra set of adult eyes in the home. And so if supervision in any way is correlated with childhood delinquency, that helps to make sense out of why single parent homes tend to be a risk factor for delinquency among kids, because the levels of supervision are associated with the parent structure, if there's two parents versus a single parent. However, that does not mean, though, that the parent structure or the level of supervision is what's causing the child to be delinquent. You have to establish that there are other things going on, establish other sources of criteria before you can make that kind of statement. So let me, my screen's freezing here on me. Okay, sorry, let me go back. Okay, so once you have correlation, great. That's the first criteria. So these things should be associated in the ways that theory would suspect. So if you look at how often is the child left alone to his or her own devices, you would expect that single parent homes are going to say more time than two parent homes. Now, it's not going to be a perfect correlation. We'll get into what really mathematically is a perfect correlation. There's just going to be some sort of a correlation or association there that follows with your theory, that supervision is less so in single parent homes, which explains why single parent homes might have higher levels of delinquency than two parent homes. Okay. Time order is another one. So you have to be sure that it's that it is the supervision having an influence on the delinquency and not the other way around. So it shouldn't be the case, if your theory is correct, that the level of supervision in the home should not be influenced by the child's level of delinquency, for instance. It could be the case that kids that are a real pain, that are real delinquent, cease to be the objects of affection by their parents because they're pains to deal with. I know that's a very unpopular thing to say, but we know in some cases that's true. I've given up on him. I can't control him. He's a wild child. He does what he wants. That can happen. Also, when kids get, not when they're little, but when they get into their teenage years, if there is a real problem with the child's behavior, that may have a real deleterious effect on marital bonds and relationship bonds, and that may cause relationship distress, and the parents end up splitting because the kid is that much of a pain. And now, again, that's an unpopular thing to say, but we know it happens sometimes. So we just have to make sure that if ultimately our dependent variable here is the level of child delinquency, that we don't go down a path just assuming that, well, nothing really that the child is doing could possibly cause the marriage to dissolve. No, we don't want to. See, we get into this issue of being politically correct. We don't want to do that. It might be the case that really why the kid is so delinquent, he's violent or she's violent, she might be an alcoholic, and really this is causing the family to split up. And so the time ordering may be backwards. And so we have to, we cannot just assume just because of correlation that the way we think these things are related are in fact related in the direction that they're related. So if it's really causing that, then what you should see is that delinquency of the child should go up after there is a breaking up of the family, not the other way around. So it should be the case that the child is relatively well behaved the family for reasons unrelated to the delinquency, because the delinquency is not changing. The parents split, who knows, for whatever reason. And then after that, you see the child engaging in a much more risky behavior. Okay, so time order is really important here. What came first, the chicken or the egg? That's the kind of thing we're getting at. So you have correlation or association, time order, and then you have to show that the relationship between X and Y are genuine or non-spurious. Spurious just means it's not genuine. There's something else going on that explains it. So it could be some third variable that one is not taking account of, such as a shared personality trait between parent and child may account for the lax parenting styles, the low levels of supervision, as well as the child's delinquent behavior. Because after all, if you are the biological offspring of mom and dad have personality traits that make them prone to antisocial behavior, and we know there are such things out there that can do this. It's not usually the most important thing, but we know this is a possibility that this may be driving both the parenting behavior as well as the delinquent behavior in the child. And so it's sometimes more obvious than other times that there is some third unaccounted for variable, but we always have to be open to the possibility that we have not measured all the things in our survey that really are important, that are affecting our X's and our Y's, that are affecting the things that we think are causing an influence in Y, but we have not accounted for them. So you always have to be kind of humble when you're looking at some correlation matrix and drawing conclusions based on, especially when you just have bivariate relationships, looking at the relationship between X and Y, because there may be some additional things that you're not thinking of. And so, if so, it's true. If personality traits that may have a genetic basis give rise to parenting practices that are not perfectly ideal, and also give rise to behavior that's not perfectly ideal, then it could be the possibility that the relationship between supervision and delinquency is just spurious. There really is no real relationship between how much a child is supervised and how much delinquency they get involved in. Maybe not, but it's a possibility that you cannot brush aside without considering the possibility that, yeah, there are differences that can emerge way early in childhood, may have a partly genetic basis. It explains why the parents are the way they are, and explains why the child is the way she is. And so that is a possibility. Some others that use these in other classes, but they kind of illustrate why you don't want to just automatically assume a correlation between two things is causation. We know ice cream sales, for instance, are positively correlated with violence. That is, when ice cream sales rise, so do levels of violence rise. We know very well, though, it's not the eating of ice cream that causes people to be violent. Both are tied to the summer months, that both go up. Sales of ice cream go up in summer, and rates of violent crime go up in the summer. It could be a direct result of heat. It could be a result of teenagers not in school, that they're out kind of left to their own devices doing God knows what. And so, they beef with one another, they fight, trying to establish their dominance and things like this. Is especially what young men will do. And so, yeah, it may not be ice cream, obviously, is not causing people to be violent. It'd be interesting if it did, but that's just not what's happening. Visits to the hospital, we know, are positively correlated with death, but it's probably not the hospital itself that's killing you. Illness increases illness is going to increase the likelihood of going to the hospital, serious illness. It's also going to increase the likelihood of you dying. And so another one that's fairly obvious here, that in most cases, I mean, maybe you get an infection in the hospital, maybe the nurse really messes up and does something that she shouldn't, or he shouldn't, but most of the time, the reason why death rates are high in hospitals are because of illness causing people to go to the hospital, as well as to die. Okay, so those are the three basic criteria for causality. That is, if you want to say that X causes Y, you need to, one, show that the things are associated or correlated somehow. in ways that fit with your hypothesis and your theory. Two, there's time order. So you need to make sure that X is really causing the influence on Y and not the other way around. It's not Y causing an influence on X. And then third, non-spuriousness, that you want to make sure that what you think is really causing an influence on the outcome on the dependent variable really is, and it's not just an illusion. That really what's happening is there's some third variable unaccounted for in your data set. Perhaps you can't measure it. Only recently have we've had these large surveys where you take genetic samples from people. So that's becoming increasingly more common when we do big social type surveys that ask people self-report behavior, that now they're also they're taking genetic samples. And so you can, I have one of these data sets. It's part of the AdHealth data set that you can actually account for a genetic variance. And when you do that, you do see that some things turn out to be spurious, but it's usually, it doesn't totally account for the original thing that you think. Like typically, when it comes to parent-child relationships, you usually can't account for that purely with genetic stuff. You have to look at the relationship between the parent and the child, the levels of supervision, the structure of the family, all that stuff matters. It all usually matters. Not a huge amount, but it matters a little bit. They all tend to matter a little bit. So, but there are some things where you can account for stuff and you can see, well, that relationship was totally spurious because it's really this thing that's causing variation in X and Y. It's some unexplained third factor. Okay. So in addition to establishing causation, there are different types of causes. Well, really just two causes, and this is something that not only social scientists talk about, but philosophers will get into this. It's called necessary and sufficient causes. So if something is necessary, if it's a necessary cause, these are conditions which must be met for the effect to follow, but are not necessarily sufficient for that effect to follow. Okay, so a few examples. So like taking college courses, that's necessary to get a college degree. However, you may not complete the courses with passing grades. So it's not sufficient in and of itself just to take classes that you're going to get a college degree. I remember a kind of funny story. Maybe it's not so funny because it was kind of an upsetting situation. There was I think it was a student, a nursing student in Marywood. This was years ago, so none of you probably know who this person is. The student was claiming, well, I took 100% of the courses, so I should get 100% of the credit. But she had really lousy grades in a number of courses, did not have the grade point average to pass. And she was, it was had to be explained to her that, well, while taking courses are necessary, it's not sufficient though for you to get a degree. There's a thing called letter grades, and you have to have a high enough letter grade across a number of courses to get the GPA. Usually it's only 2.3. I don't, the nursing program may be a little bit higher than 2.33, but you get my point that this sometimes has to be really explained to people, because they will say, well, I did what was necessary. Yeah, you did what was necessary, but you didn't, it's not sufficient. So arrest is necessary to stop, is a necessary step prior to incarceration. If you're incarcerated in jail or in prison, that means you had to have been arrested, at least in the American legal system. However, it's not sufficient. You may only get probation. That's what happens with a lot of first-time nonviolent offenders. You're going to get probation, like a lot of drug offenders. Unless you have also some violent charges coming up against you, you will most likely just get probation. So it's necessary, but not sufficient. A marriage is a necessary condition for divorce to apply. So if you're getting divorced, by definition, you had to have been married. However, not all marriages into divorce, only about half meet this end. So it's not that, well, now I'm married, so that's all I need to get divorced, and so I'm going to get divorced. That would be awful. It's just that it is a necessary condition, but not sufficient for a divorce to occur. Okay, so that's necessary conditions. But there are also these what's called sufficient conditions. So you may have sufficient causation. So this is a condition that, if met, the outcome or effect is guaranteed, or at least is highly likely. For example, skipping an exam is sufficient for failing a course. However, it's not necessary. You don't have to do that in order to fail a course. You could fail in lots of other ways. You could just have lots of low exam scores, okay? So sufficient, but not necessary. sex with someone infected with HIV is sufficient for contracting the disease. However, you can also get HIV by injection drugs and blood transfusions too. So sufficient, but not necessary. You can get it in other ways. Murder is a sufficient condition for prison time. Okay, if you do that, that's all that really needs to happen. However, you can make it into prison under multiple offenses. You don't have to commit murder to get into prison. You traffic large amounts of drugs. You may get probation, but most likely, especially in the federal system, they will nail you to the wall. And folks, if you're going to get busted for drugs, don't get busted in the federal system. That's the one where it's really, really aggressive, and it's become under a lot of criticism the last well, really for 20 years now. And that's where you have a lot of racial disparities and stuff. It's actually in the federal system. The federal system is really bad. But anyway, so yeah, this is sufficient conditions. These are conditions that are good enough to get you to that outcome, but you don't have to. They don't have to be met in order for that outcome to happen, because other things could be going on. Okay, so this is where I'd like to give you all a few minutes to think about causes for things that social scientists would study. So what causes people to do these things? Commit crimes, drop out of high school, smoke cigarettes. Okay, so these are all things that most all people know that you're not supposed to do. Everybody knows, unless it's some obscure law regarding with medical marijuana or weapons or something like that, where you really may not know the law. People know you're not supposed to rape, rob, and murder other people. Everybody who's been socialized in the United States and most of the rest of the world knows this. They know this is bad. In the United States and most of the Western world, you know that you're not supposed to drop out of high school. And it was not true in the back of the 1950s, but nowadays everybody knows you're not supposed to be smoking cigarettes. That's just not good for you. So it's not that people, it cannot be explained by people being unaware of this. You have to think of other reasons why people would, even knowing it's wrong, commit crimes, why they even knowing it's wrong, drop out of high school, why even knowing it's not a good idea to smoke cigarettes. So whatever your reasons, they could be reasons that are, not politically correct. They could be reasons that are maybe hard to, at least first approximation, think that they're reasonable arguments. So long they are reasonable, and we have to consider them so long as they pass the 3 criteria for causation. In your argumentation, you'd have to be able to figure out a way to show that one thing is correlated with the other. That there's a time ordering that makes sense here, that it's really this that's causing this, and non-spuriousness, that it is not some other factor that you're not accounting for, that you didn't even think to account for, that could be causing this. And also, we want to think, are you talking about causation that's necessary, or is it meeting more likely the sufficient conditions of causation? It could be both. It could be necessary and sufficient, but usually we talk about these things separately. So take a few minutes here and think if you can come up with, and they don't have to be super sophisticated. Usually the simpler the explanation, the better. The simpler, the better. And so long as you can think of, okay, you could do crime, you could do high school dropout, you could do smoking cigarettes. What do you think causes people to do this? You would have to think of, well, it has to be something that we could show. If you do this more often, or you experience this, you're more likely to do this. That's a correlation, that it's really this thing that's causing this thing and not the other way around. And that it's non-spurious. And then think about, is this a necessary condition, that this has to happen in order for this to occur? Or is it a sufficient condition, that is, that all you need to have happen is this, but it's not necessary. Other things could happen in order for that to occur. So yeah, take about 5 minutes here, and I will see what you come up with. So yeah, go ahead and do that. We'll reconvene here at about 1:33, and we'll see if you don't have to feel like you have to lay out like a super sophisticated argument for this. You're just doing this right on the spot. So anything that occurs to you, but be thinking about especially these things of correlation, time order, and non-spuriousness. The necessary and sufficient conditions stuff is sometimes a little bit tricky to tease out right on the spot here, but correlation, time order, and non-spuriousness. Try to think of a way that we would be able to like a test of that. Like, how would we know that you're meeting the criteria for causation? How could we know that you're meeting the criteria for time order effects? And how do we know that you're you're probably not just leaving something out? What would you do for that? So take a couple minutes and see what you come up with. I'm gonna mute my mic for just a moment. Okay, folks. Anybody have any ideas on how would we explain any one of these? Yeah, Tyler, just shout out if because I may not necessarily be able to see you. Yeah, I'm gonna take the screen off here just so I can see everybody. Okay, Tyler, I saw your hand. What did you have?
For smoking cigarettes, could it be like peer pressure?
Okay, peer pressure. So how would we measure peer pressure? How would we know that it's probably peer pressure that's
Um,
doing it?
could you look at like someone's friend group and kind of observe how much their friends are smoking or pushing them to do it?
Yeah, so definitely that's a good start. So you can look at the a peer group, what proportion of your friends also smoke cigarettes. Also, you could ask them, this is sometimes very revealing, how many of your friends think that smoking makes you more attractive, makes you cool, makes you all those things. So that may not be a direct measure of peer pressures, but you're kind of getting at it in an indirect way. Like, okay, this person is probably under a lot of social influence of smoke. Over half of her peers smoke. It seems like she thinks anyway that her friends think it's cool to smoke. And so right there you say, okay, well, it looks like at least correlation. We have a correlation there. So how about time order? Did you think about how can you tell that it's not that she was just prone to smoking and so she sought out other people who had cigarettes she could bum off of? Like that could, it could be flipped.
You could kind of find out when she started and maybe look at that's a little tough. Maybe look at the friend
No,
group
you,
and
yeah,
started.
right when she started. Good. If she started smoking cigarettes well before she ran into that peer group, then it's probably not the peer group that is bad influence on her. She may be the bad influence on the peer group. She comes in with all that. She's like, "Hey guys, let's go get some cigarettes," and so she is the bad influence. It's not the other way around. So, despite what her parents may want to believe, like, "Oh, she got mixed in with the bad group," no, your kid was the one that was the deviant one. And so it could be. So what? How about non-spuriousness? How can we tell it's not some third factor? Or what other third factors might you want to account for to make sure that it really is the peer group that's having an influence on the smoking behavior, and not smoking behavior is being influenced by some third factor that's causing the smoking behavior in the individual, but also causing people to be attracted to other people who happen to smoke cigarettes? Could you think of some other thing you'd want to make sure and account for?
Um, would you look for that? Would you look at like other causes for smoking, like maybe like stress, like factors in her life or something like
Yes.
that?
Yeah. Very good. Very good. Yeah. Anything that you think might cause smoking, you should account for that in your study. Like, for instance, do her parents smoke? That's, something like that. It could be more complicated or be pretty simple like that. Very good. Okay. What else? Anybody have any other ones? Okay, Jared, then we'll go Rebecca.
I thought of a life-altering event, maybe such as like losing a job or family member, may cause people to change like their normal life to a life of crime or commit a serious crime due to that event.
Yeah, so you'd want to see people who had more traumatic events should be more likely on average to commit crime, right? So that's your causation. What would be the time ordering for that then? How would we assume that it's not? Because you could also see that people who have these really criminal, gritty lifestyles, because of that, they may experience more life traumatizing events, And so how can we tell it's not the other way around? What would you try to look at for a time order to satisfy
Um,
that?
I'd probably try and look at their lifestyle before whatever event happened, and then look at it after. Because if they were a normal, like compliant citizen before, and then after you started seeing DUIs,
Mm-hmm.
assaults, and stuff like that, then you can relate that traumatic event to why it happened.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so you want to be able to look at things over time and be able to take measures before and after the traumatic event, in addition to accounting for the traumatic event, like when did it happen exactly? Good. So, and can you think of any other spurious things that you'd want to account for to make sure the relationship between traumatic events and crime is not spurious? Like, what other things could cause somebody to commit crime and also experience traumatic events? You can think of anything that might fall under that category. So we have to do that too. We have to make sure that we're accounting for everything possible that might create or cause the two things to happen.
I mean, you can maybe look at like someone's like financial, see if they have serious debt. Maybe that could have caused it too, if it wasn't a traumatic life event or other
Yeah.
stuff that may impulse them to commit a crime.
Yeah, anything in their background that is that we know from prior research is correlated with criminal activity, and also correlated with just encountering what seems to be a series of bad luck events like that. That kind of thing would have to be done for people to say, yeah, it really does seem to be a traumatic life event, independent of these other things, is causing an influence on the crime outcome. Good. Yeah, Rebecca.
I said that an unstable home life and careless parents might cause someone to drop out of high school.
Okay, so what would we? So how would you first establish causation there? The correlation. How would you establish that the things are correlated? What would you be wanting to measure? What would you want to look at?
Like how the parents treat the kids, if they're constantly fighting, if they're like abusive in any way, like physically, mentally.
Yeah, okay, so we want to have some sort of measures of abuse, neglect. Okay, so we want to have that in there. So we'd want to see, it should be the case that kids that are more likely to drop out of school are the same kids who report, and it could be official records of social services intervening, that those kids are the ones that also experience these things, that social services are intervening. There's evidence of abuse and neglect. And that's pretty well known that, yeah, the kids that drop out of high school, usually there's got to be something going on for kids to do that, because kids, even though they may not like to do their algebra homework, they want to be around other kids, like going to high school, you want to be, so like there's got to be something going on for them to just totally disengage from that like it's something usually pretty serious. What would you say though would be you'd want to account for to make sure that time ordering is correct? How would you account for that?
You could probably talk to like previous teachers and other extended family members to see if the parents were like unstable before they dropped out of school, or if like they were completely fine and the kid just dropped out anyway.
Yeah, that's a good thing to establish, because some kids will drop out and it's a mystery because they come from a fairly stable background. It's like, what, and they just want to go out and be like Jack Kerouac and have an adventure or something, they want to live off the grid, they get involved. So that sometimes there is that, but yeah, if you can establish that, well, there is a long history of abuse and neglect. We have records going back to before this kid was 4 years old, before he was even in school, this stuff going on, and you see this buildup of social services then intervening later on and things when the kid gets a little bit bigger. These things, you could look at over time. How about things that you'd want to account for to make sure this is a non-spurious relationship? So what would you account for that might account for maybe the abusive behavior of the parents as well as the kid dropping out of high school? What things?
You could probably rule out like any kind of substance abuse, because if the parents are like alcoholics or on drugs, they might be unstable. But if the child like is doing drugs as well, that could cause them to drop out of school. So you want to like make sure that's not a factor first.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's definitely the case that you'd probably want to account for levels of substance abuse, because we know substance abuse it may not be necessary, but in some cases it does seem to be a sufficient cause for all kinds of problems. That a lot of us, we can get away with alcohol use and some marijuana use, but for some people, that it really is not a good idea. It seems to kind of spiral out of control, and it can be, of course, looks like a causal factor in the real problems that a lot of people are experiencing. So so good. What else? Who else has one that you might want to talk about? Yeah, Christy?
I thought maybe living in an area of poverty or where there's not many jobs available.
Okay. For which outcome?
For committing crime.
Okay, yeah. So causation requires correlation. So what would you be expecting in your correlation or association? What would you be expecting to see?
So for the job one, not having available jobs, maybe they don't have the money to get food or the money to pay their rent or things like that. They'd have to rob people or sell drugs, something like that to, make do.
Sure, but Yeah, so for simple correlation though, we would just want to show that like rates of poverty are high in the same places where we have rates of crime being high, right? There should be, and you can show that quite easily, that it tends to be the case that when we look at where poverty is the worst throughout the United States, that's where we also tend to find higher rates, especially violent crime. Now, it's not necessarily the case though that one is causing the other, and so that's a big subject of research for a lot of criminologists and sociologists, this relationship between poverty and crime. What would be the time order though with that? How would you tell that it's really not, because it could be the case that, well, it looks like there's a correlation there, but really what's happening, people who are criminals tend to not get stable jobs because they're criminals, and they end up living in poverty. So it's crime is causing poverty, not poverty causing crime. So how would you counter that argument if someone says, well, it's just they're criminals and they didn't land a good job because they can't get along with people? That's what's doing it. What would you say to them?
I'd say maybe looking at a certain area of poverty or where there's a lot of crime, seeing if there was more available jobs before, and seeing if there was a correlation between the rise of crime, if jobs were dropped and things like that.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, you'd want to see that there was a decline in stable work, and then in the following year, there's an increase in serious crime. The rates. There's a lagged, it's lagged, so it's not, so it's pretty clear that, well, economic situations deteriorated, and then in the following year, we get this spike in homicides and robberies and things like that. What would be other things you would account for that could cause someone to be involved in criminal behavior, but also find themselves in an impoverished state? What might be, when you think of someone might say, well, I think the relationship is still spurious. I think that there's other things that you need to account for before we can make this broad sweeping statement that poverty is the kind of the driver of crime. What would you say?
That was a hard one. I guess maybe look at their family history. If their family has a history of committing crimes, or the people they hang around and hang out with, if
Yep.
they commit crimes, they're going to be more entitled or more inclined to commit crimes themselves.
Yeah, it could be. There's a lot to say about family background, because if you look at impoverished areas, believe it or not, most of the people there are not involved in serious crime, but there are a few families that are heavily involved in serious crime. Elijah Anderson has this book called Code of the Streets, and he talks about inner city areas in Philadelphia. It's an impoverished area, but he says there are decent families, and then there's street families living right across from one another. And even though the decent family is living at the same level of poverty, their kids turn out okay, whereas the street families where there's just a lot of dysfunction in the home, they end up turning out far worse and end up more likely in prison. So there is, yeah, family background be something you'd want to account for, because just because you're living below the poverty line doesn't mean that you have poverty as kind of a state of mind. You're just broke. Those are two different things, being broke and having poverty as a state of mind, you know. So that's something that it's really important we count for that family background influence, because then that opens up all types of, like, is it parenting, is it genes, like what's going on here? Good. Okay. Any others that people would want to put forward as examples of how we would kind of establish these? We didn't talk about necessary and sufficient conditions for these. That's where we'll hold that maybe for a later discussion, or just not do it right now. But anyone else want to? All right, folks. Yeah. So good. So those are some really good examples. We went through. Okay. All right. Is that a message from somebody? All right. So let me go back to my. Hopefully, come on, just open up. Good. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So this is the kind of mental exercises you want to go through even before you start collecting data. That you have a general idea on what you want to get at, what the purpose of the study is, but you want to have mapped out what you think is causing what, some at least tentative hypotheses and go through this really sort of very self-critical analysis of your assumptions about things, that what you think is causing what, like what do we already know? And this is why whenever you're doing a study, usually requires a tremendous amount of reading prior research so you can figure out what's already been done, what's already known, and how you're going to add your 2 cents to understand something as complex as like health behavior, education, or crime, because these are very complex behaviors. There's a lot of things that influence them. It's not, in many ways, physicists have it better off. They have it easier because what they're trying to show, one thing causes the other, can be very much isolated to very specific things. But when you get into the social sciences, that's why it's called the soft sciences. It's not because it's easy, it's because there are so many things that are influencing health behavior and criminal behavior and education attainment, that it can be very trickier problem to figure out, much trickier than what some physicists are trying to do when they're trying to figure out what subatomic particles, their behavior. Okay, so when we're doing social science research, we will often want to specify at what level or unit of analysis are we going to focus. And now I think for all of these examples, I think I have violence or aggressive behavior as the main outcome. For a lot of surveys, the units of analyses are individual persons, individual people. And so at the individual level, we might say, for example, this is one example, that people who are violent may be that way because they have what Dodge, the psychologist, called hostile attribution bias. And this is where people are a little paranoid, on edge. Why are you looking at me like that? Just they will interpret minor insults or just even ambiguous behavior, like, hey man, I didn't mean anything by that, as a real personal slight against them, and they have to defend their honor. It's especially true for young men, and they will go after each other and try to kill one another. And so Dodge says we're all kind of born with hostile attribution bias. We get, like, when infants will, little kids, you can see this, they're very violent towards one another. They'll always assume that the person that did an accidentally touched them or something did it on purpose and maliciously. We as adults, we get better at, we try not to have that hostile attribution bias. That's at the individual level. The individual, though, looking at, even if you have a perfect measure of hostile attribution bias at the individual level, it may not be good enough, because this unit of analysis may ignore the social conditions from which individuals develop this type of personality, at least their inability to sort of get this under control, that you're ignoring everything that's going around in their social life, what is happening in the family, what's happening in their neighborhood, to explain why it is that they seem to have a real chip on their shoulder. And if anybody looks at them in the eye for more than 3 seconds, they freak out. Okay, something is up here that you may not be able to really suss out just by looking even at a very perfect analysis or measure of how much hostile attribution each individual person actually possesses in your data set. Okay, so that's units of analysis at the individual level. A lot of social science research, even though we're interested in higher levels of units of analysis, it's still the individual usually is the one that's surveyed, because you can't directly talk to a county, or you can't talk to really, usually the whole family is not involved in these things. But the next level up that a lot of social scientists are interested in, especially sociologists that look at the dynamics of families. And so we know that the family is a primary source of socialization and may therefore play a key contributing role in the above individual differences that we're talking about. And so DeMuth and Brown, these are two professors at Bowling Green State University that I studied under. They did this study this a while ago now, but they found that youths from single parent homes are less likely to experience the levels of parental supervision and involvement present more often in 2-parent homes, which in turn is related to higher levels of delinquency. So what explains the parent structure effect, or the family structure effect, of like 2-parent homes? Kids in 2-parent homes tend to fare better on average than kids from single parent homes, is what they call family process, or just the relationship and what is going on between the parent and child. That tends to explain the family structure effect. So it may not be good enough just to look at the individual, and it may not be good enough to even look at the family structure. That so long as a single parent, that if he or she is able to do the things as good as what is going on in a two-parent home, then their child may not be at any greater risk for delinquency than kids from a two-parent home. Okay, so that's what that study is showing. But you really, unless you have measures of the family and things going on at the family level, then this explanation just may be elusive to you, or you may not be able to account for it in your study. But if you look at the family, this unit of analysis may ignore the fact where you're just looking at families, that's your focus. We're going to focus on the family. This unit of analysis may ignore the fact that single parent homes and high crime rates tend to co-occur in the same social spaces. So just like poverty and crime co-occur in the same social space, single parent homes and crime co-occur in the same social spaces, like in neighborhoods. And you may therefore be ignoring the impact of what's going on in the community around that family, because you may have a single mom that's trying her very best. She's doing everything right. Everything is being done right, but you're living in a neighborhood filled with what Elijah Anderson called street families. And so people who are not doing the right thing, they're doing a lot of bad things that you're not supposed to do, like abuse your kids, so that's why it may really pay off to look at a higher level unit of analysis to make sense out of what's going on. So the families are usually nested within these larger community context that may in turn influence the family dynamics. And so family dynamics, as you can understand, if you're living in a high crime rate area, your family dynamics may be very different as opposed to living in an area that has very low crime rates. And so a researcher some time ago, South in '92, he found that communities in which there is an imbalanced sex ratio, so when there's more gender, there's more than one gender than another, like there's a high level of men compared to the women, there's a high proportion of women compared to the number of men, that has those communities, those census block groups specifically, they have higher average rates of divorce and single parent homes. And this is because if people have a lot of partner alternatives to choose from, so if there's an excess number of men, then women do not have to stick with a partner that they find unsatisfying. Likewise, if there's an excess number of women in a population, there's a greater proportion of women in the population than men have a lot of partner alternatives to choose from. And so this causes people to split from their partner. They feel like they don't have to stay together because they have lots of options. So you find this, that it seems that societies run smoothly when there's a balanced sex ratio, when there's a balanced number of men and women in the population, because your options are limited. You have to deal with your partner's problems. You have to be friends. You have to work things out because the romantic stage will fade, and you have to be adults about this. But if you have a lot of alternatives, you may not want to go through marriage counseling. You may like, let's call it quits. I'm dating that guy. He seems like he has it more together. And so clearly this is not a family level thing. It's not an individual level thing. By definition, a sex ratio is like a population community level variable, because your sex ratio, you don't have a sex ratio, you have a sex or you have a gender. And families don't talk about families having a sex ratio, although you could, but typically you're talking about a higher level unit of analysis. You're talking about sometimes counties or census block groups where you see that there's really an excess number of women compared to the number of men. And in those places, you actually have higher homicide rates. It's not because the women are committing the crimes, it's because a lot of men are not committed to marriage and they go out and do what men do when they're not pinned down by marriage. But even here, this unit of analysis may ignore even larger contextual factors that influence the variability at the community level. So there may be these broad cultural influences that are really outside of the control of anyone in these communities, and they have an impact on how these communities think and feel about one another and how they interact. So a couple points here of going back to this idea of the baloney detection kit and logical fallacies. There is this specific kind of thing that's related to looking at higher units of analysis and making inferences about the people within those larger units of analyses. And this is called the ecological fallacy. So just because homicide here is correlated with poverty, you cannot necessarily say therefore poverty causes homicide, or that people that live in poverty are more physically aggressive than people who live in middle-class communities. That would be called, or especially you shouldn't be saying this, that because this person comes from a poverty area, I am not going to trust him or her because I think that person is going to be more violently aggressive. That's called the ecological fallacy. You don't want to ever go from a higher level unit of analysis and make any specific claim about any lower levels of units analysis, because what you're doing is committing the ecological fallacy. As I said before, it looks like in impoverished areas, it's not as if all the kids in these areas are gangbangers. A lot of them don't want anything to do with that any more than you want something to do with that. But there are some in there that really make up for the difference big time. There's always this shocking statistic that that's found in lots of large-scale studies that that only about 5% of offenders are responsible for more than 50% of all serious index crimes in a given city or given area. So you have this real lopsided distribution where you have some really hardcore criminals, and then other people in these communities want nothing to do with them, even though they're also living in poverty, they're struggling with their own issues, but they don't go out and rape, rob, and murder people. So you don't want to make that, it's not about, also, it's just not about just being politically correct here, folks. I have to keep repeating it. It's not about that. It's just illogical to make that leap. Okay, so you don't want to go from higher levels of units analysis down to making specific statements about people within those, because it may only apply to a small fraction of the people who are living in poverty, that they are the ones that are more physically aggressive. So at that point, you may be thinking, well, it's not the poverty then, it's got to be something else, because most of the people in these communities want nothing to do with serious criminal behavior. There is also a flip to this. There's something called the individualistic fallacy. And it says basically, if individuals commit crimes, therefore it is within the individual that the causes of crime will be discovered. That also can be fallacious reasoning. That if you think, well, it's not, a community doesn't stand up, like the buildings don't get up and start fighting with one another. Like, what are you talking about? And families are a social construct. We call these things families, where men and women usually will have children together. And, this is, so, and it's not like the family itself somehow is this separate unit, that forms like a Voltron thing and goes after and fights other families. So we don't want to read into because individuals commit the crimes, we don't want to think then therefore it is only at the individual level that the causes of crime might be discovered, because you could sit there and with all the perfect assessments of their personality, their genetic profile, everything, every intimate detail about a person, it may still not explain why it is they got involved in this seriously violent drug gang. It may be that they were really no more prone to violence than the next person, but because of bad luck, being at the wrong place at the wrong time, they were seduced to perhaps pressured and felt no other choice but to get involved in this stuff. And so that's what's called the individualistic fallacy. So even though individuals commit crimes, they are clearly the thing that's physically doing it. It may not be at the individual level where you discover that is that the reasons for the crime are not discoverable at that individual level. Okay. So those are different units of analysis. And this is something that when a researcher sets out to research, she has to consider, well, do we, okay, so we're surveying individuals, right? So do we need to survey, for example, or take account of the rates of poverty in the census block group in which they are living? So a lot of studies like At Health, this big data set that you guys will be working with later, it has measures at the census block group level. So the census has these blocks, which are basically just a couple, it's a like it sounds like it's a neighborhood block, and then they lump them all together like this is a block group. Like in like Green Ridge area in Scranton here, crosses over with Dunmore. I don't know how many block groups are in it. I think just a couple. So that's like 2 block groups. So you could look at things at a block, the census block group level, and say, okay, what percent is single parent? What percent is living below the poverty line? What percent is this? What percent is that? Unemployment? All those sort of things. This is what the researcher, he will need to figure that out, because you don't want to tie your hands or blind yourself to these other higher level things that are measured at these higher units of analysis, like the sex ratio. That's another one that people have looked at that with respect to not only divorce, but crime levels. And so when it gets really imbalanced, you see violent crime going up as well. And so you can't see that at the individual level. It's impossible because by definition, it's not an individual trait. A sex ratio is a trait of a population. It's not the trait of an individual. Okay, but it nonetheless affects the behaviors and the attitudes of individuals. Okay, so that's what I think I'm going to stop here today. I don't want to get it because there's these different types of studies that are often done in the social sciences, and we'll cover all these basic ones I think on Thursday, and that will be it. So are there any comments or questions about anything that people want to put out there before I go ahead and let you go? Alrighty, folks. So if there is something, let me know. There is that chapter question, the chapter question that's due tomorrow, and then there's another one for the end of I think it's chapter 4 that you also can be working on, but that's not due for another week or so. So go ahead and take a look at that, and we will reconvene then on Thursday. But that is it for today. Alrighty. Okay, folks, take care. I will see you then on Thursday. Bye-bye.